Hello, and thanks for tuning into this video. My name is Richard, and I run a company called Muddy York Walking Tours. I offer many different historical presentations and walking tours of Toronto. I've put together a presentation on the history of the Eaton family, their department store, and the annual Toronto Santa Claus Parade. I've made the presentation available here on YouTube so that it can be enjoyed by a broader audience. I usually charge for my presentations and walking tours, but I don't currently have any subscription fees for anything that I post on my YouTube channel, so you're welcome to watch and enjoy. Having said that, donations are welcome, but not necessary. If you'd like to make a donation, you can email me at richard@muddyyorktours.com to make arrangements. If you enjoyed this presentation, please let your friends know about me. Anyone can contact me through my website at www.muddyyorktours.com. You can also find the Muddy York Walking Tour group on Facebook or look me up on Instagram for lots more about Toronto's history. All my contact information is listed in the video description below. For now, though, please sit back and enjoy my presentation on Eaton'S and the Toronto Santa Claus Parade. There are really two subjects in my presentation today. The first is a history of the Toronto Santa Claus Day Parade, but since the parade was originally sponsored by Eaton's department store, I've also included a history of the Eaton family and the Canadian retail empire that they built. Both these subjects are full of nostalgia, so I've tried to weave them both together in my presentation. My presentation should run for about 45 minutes. And again, if you have any questions, comments, or memories, I would encourage you to leave them in the comments section for this video. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And once again, you can also contact me through my website at www.muddyyorktours.com. Let's start with some history of how Eaton's department stores got started. Timothy Eaton was born in 1834, and he grew up on a farm in a town called Ballymena in Northern Ireland. He was the youngest of 9 children, all of whom worked hard on the family farm. But Timothy Eaton wanted more. He became a shopkeeper's apprentice and then emigrated to Ontario in 1854. Timothy Eaton made history when he opened his first store in Toronto in 1869. This is a drawing of it. It was located at 178 Yonge Street, just north of Queen Street. Timothy Eaton's new store grew slowly at first, but eventually he drew in customers from the city's growing middle class. Timothy Eaton was soon establishing some brand new retail policies in his Yonge Street store. The first of these was to insist that customers pay for goods at a fixed price at a time when most stores let their customers barter or haggle. This led to Eaton's promise of goods satisfactory or money refunded, meaning that if customers weren't satisfied, he would give them their money back. Timothy Eaton also insisted that everyone pay in cash. Buying on credit was not allowed. Timothy Eaton's early retail strategies were a success. In 1883, he opened a second store just up the street at 190 Yonge Street. The new store had enormous plate glass windows, which were a novelty at the time, but they were ideal for displaying Eaton's merchandise. The store had other innovations too, like electric lights and a sprinkler system, and these were both very modern for the 1880s. Another Eaton's innovation came in 1862 when Timothy started publishing the store's very first mail order catalog, and I've shown the very first edition of the store catalog here. It had 32 pages and was distributed from coast to coast. Canada was still mostly an agrarian country in the 1880s, and the Eaton's catalog let people buy anything that they wanted from Eaton's without ever having to take a trip into the big city or step foot inside an Eaton store. Let's take a look at what kind of merchandise you could order. Dresses from the women's department or hats in the gentlemen's department were always popular, but shoppers could find everything from sporting goods to musical instruments to groceries to early drugs and pharmaceuticals to furniture. Eaton's was now a full-fledged department store. And Timothy Eaton kept growing his empire. By the first few years of the 1900s, Timothy Eaton's buildings covered 22 acres at Yonge and Queen Streets. There was a factory and a warehouse for the store's mail order business. There were waiting rooms, restaurants, parcel checks, a shoe repair, and free local bus service, and there was plenty of retail shopping space. And somehow Timothy Eaton had found time to build a family. On May the 28th, 1862, he married Margaret Wilson Beatty. The couple had a total of 5 sons and 3 daughters together. They built a dynasty together and guaranteed that the Eaton family name would continue. Timothy Eaton gave his wife and their children a life of wealth and comfort. He had this house built for his family in 1889. It was located at the northwest corner of Spadina Road and Lowther Avenue in the heart of Toronto's fashionable Annex neighborhood, and it was nothing short of a mansion. A glimpse inside the Eaton's home shows us a little bit about the interior design of the late 1800s. I think that these days, most of us would probably find this a little bit cluttered, but this was considered quite fashionable in the Eaton's time. Every surface was covered with knickknacks and mementos, and a lot of the furnishings in Timothy Eaton's home were supplied from his own department store. By the time that the early 1900s came around, Timothy Eaton had built himself into a household institution, thanks to his success as the head of Canada's top retail chain. But Timothy Eaton left one more legacy to the families of Toronto. Eaton sponsored the very first ever Santa Claus Parade in 1905, although the original parade was a very modest affair. In fact, that first parade was hardly a parade at all. Santa Claus arrived by train here at Old Union Station, which has long since been demolished. Santa was all by himself as he walked up the main Eaton store at Queen Street on that cold, windy day back on December the 2nd, 1905. There were no floats, no clowns, and no elves. All we have from that original parade is this one grainy black and white photograph of Santa. But this first simple parade was such a hit that it became more and more elaborate, with a horse-drawn carriage, footmen, and trumpeters added over the next couple of years. This was Eaton's Christmas catalog from 1905, the year of that first parade. And although the first parade might have been pretty modest, Eaton's realized how much advertising potential the parade had. As Santa left Union Station and made his way to Eaton's store during the first parade in 1905, he laughed and waved at the crowds while he passed out toys and gifts, not to mention store catalogs, from the pack that he had over his shoulder. Now everyone knew that Eaton's department store was endorsed by none other than Santa Claus himself, and it was the place to go for Christmas shopping. Timothy Eaton died of pneumonia on January the 31st, 1907, which means that he only oversaw 2 of the annual Santa Claus parades that he worked to establish, and yet when he died, he left both the store and the parade in good hands. Timothy Eaton's son, John Craig Eaton, took over the family business. There were 2 sides to John Craig's character. On the one hand, he was the playboy prince born into one of Canada's wealthiest families. On the other hand, he was the responsible, respectable public representative of the family business. John Craig Eaton seemed to enjoy everything that went along with the wealth and privilege that he was born into. This photograph from 1912 shows him entertaining guests on his private yacht. He really seemed to enjoy life as the extroverted retail millionaire. And yet, John Craig Eaton was a family man, too. He married Flora McCrae in May of 1901. This is a photograph from 1909 showing John Craig and Flora with their first 2 children, 2 sons, Timothy, the oldest, and John David, who is the baby in the photo. The couple had 2 more sons and a daughter together, and they also adopted another daughter. The young family were soon living in the lap of luxury. The house that John's father, Timothy, had built in the Annex neighborhood was no longer good enough. For one thing, John Craig Eaton was fond of expensive cars, and the old house at Spadina Road and Lowther Avenue didn't even have a garage. So in 1909, John and Flora decided to build a new house for themselves. The Eaton's new home stood on the escarpment north of Davenport Road. The Eaton's dubbed their house Ardwald, which comes from the Gaelic term meaning high green hill. Ardwald had 50 rooms, 14 bathrooms, and its own hospital, and of course, a garage for John Craig's cars. The house sat on 11 acres of landscape grounds that included a half-acre glassed-in conservatory and swimming pool. Ardwald was one of the largest and most luxurious homes in Canada, which was in keeping with John Craig Eaton's status as one of the wealthiest men in the country. But John Craig Eaton also made a lot of contributions to helping Canadians during the First World War. A total of 3,327 Eaton's employees enlisted to serve in the war. 2,200 of these, or about two-thirds of the total, were from the Toronto store. These Eaton store veterans were often called Eaton'S, and when each and every one of them went off to serve, their photographs were taken by Eaton's department store. John Craig Eaton did what he could, both to encourage enlistment and to support his employees. He guaranteed that all married employees who enlisted would be paid their full salary for the duration of their service, in addition to any pay they received from the Army. Unmarried men who enlisted received half of their Eaton salary. In addition, he promised that each man would have his job waiting for him when he came home from the war. By the end of the war, Eaton's had paid $2.2 million in wages, which would come out to over $50 million today. This was more than any other employer in Canada. But so many of the men of Eaton's department store who went off to fight had paid so much more. And Eaton's helped to keep up morale right here at home too, in Toronto, by holding the Santa Claus Parade every year. This photograph from 1918 shows Santa arriving at Eaton's department store and climbing up a ladder to get into a special balcony. The years around the time of the First World War saw some milestones in the Santa Claus Parade. In 1913, Santa was pulled by some live reindeer that were brought in, especially from Labrador. They were taken care of by a special veterinarian and then retired to a property outside of Toronto after the parade. In 1917, the parade had grown to a total of 7 floats, and Mother Goose appeared in the parade for the first time that year. Over the years, Mother Goose would become the longest float in continuous annual service in the Santa Claus Parade, and she would be repainted a different color every year. We're used to seeing Santa Claus getting around on his sleigh pulled by reindeer, either real reindeer or more often mechanical ones. But in 1919, he arrived in town on an airplane that landed at the old Leaside Aerodrome that was located along Eglinton Avenue near Laird Drive. That same year in 1919, Santa pulled up to the Eaton store in the back of an enormous silver fish. He climbed out of the fish's back and went up a ladder to once again take his place of prominence on the Eaton store balcony. The airplane stunt was never repeated, and Santa went back to mostly getting around Toronto by sleigh. John Craig Eaton served as president of Eaton's from the time of his father's death in 1907 up until his own death in 1922. He usually headed up the Santa Claus Parade in a fancy car, but it's rumored that one year he actually played Santa Claus himself. For many years, there were actually 2 Santas. One would appear riding his sleigh on his float through the streets of Toronto, while another would serve as a backup or spare and follow along in a car with blackened windows. Santa's real identity was always a closely guarded secret, but he was usually portrayed by an Eaton store employee. And that trip up the ladder to Eaton's second-story balcony could be a real challenge for any employee. Santa faced the daunting task of hoisting his padded belly up a fire ladder from the float up to the window. More often than not, as Santa cursed and stumbled through the window into the Toyland apartment, he was resuscitated by swigs of some special Seagram's medicine provided by sympathetic store managers. The Santa Claus Parade kept drawing huge audiences. This is the crowd after the parade in 1930, and they got bigger and bigger every year. There aren't a lot of photographs of the parade before 1930. This was a time long before any of us carried a phone with a camera in our pockets, but there are a couple of early films of the Santa Claus Parade from the 1920s. Many of these newsreels were made by British or American news companies who came to Toronto to film the parade. Now, I'm going to show you one from 1924. The fact that it was made by a British news agency shows how the parade had become a huge, internationally known attraction. Now, the film starts off with four men dressed as chefs carrying a platform with an enormous model of a roast turkey. Next comes a gigantic caterpillar, like a Chinese dragon, and we can already see the crowds that have lined the streets to watch the parade. Then there's a horse-drawn float with Santa's sleigh and reindeer coming into view. We can see Santa himself in the back of the sleigh as he waves and calls out to the crowd. He was obviously very patriotic. He's seen waving a flag as he waves at the crowds. And here we can see him lowering a sack full of toys and gifts and department store catalogs to the huge number of people that were at least attempted to be controlled by police on horseback. And a number of these people in the crowd, of course, would have been children who were hoisted up by their family members to get a better look at Santa. And finally, Santa starts to mount. We'll see a little bit more footage of this as the parade continues with some of the toy soldiers, some fruit or perhaps some sugar plums dancing through the parade route. And then more floats that are drawn by horses. And some clowns that are taking a tumble. Here's another float of the little old lady who lives in the shoe, followed by one of the enormous caterpillar. And then again, a horse-drawn carriage showing some people dressed in the 1800s style of clothing with their footmen walking alongside. A chef on a long float. And again, some toy soldiers marching through the streets as they join the parade. And then again, Santa mounting the balcony. He's joined by a couple of clowns and some bears. And again, just another shot of the massive crowds that had gathered outside the store. That newsreel that I just showed of the Santa Claus Parade from 1924 is the earliest film recording of the parade that I've been able to find. Now, sadly, John Craig Eaton had died 2 years earlier in 1922, but the Eaton'S family department store and its parade kept going and was continued by other members of the family. After John Craig Eaton died, his wife Flora and their son John David Eaton became the public face of the family business. Flora had spent years molding John David into becoming the next president of the Eaton family firm. Together, Flora Eaton and John David Eaton oversaw one of the greatest retail landmarks ever built in Canada. This was the original architectural plan for Eaton's College Street store. It was originally meant to include 5 million square feet of retail space and a 38-story skyscraper. But when the hard times of the Great Depression hit near the end of 1929, plans for the building were dramatically scaled down. When it was finished, the building only took up 600,000 square feet and not the 5 million square feet that the original design called for. And it was only built to a height of 7 stories instead of the 38 floors that were originally planned. But it was still like a palace for Canadian commerce. Toronto had never seen the like of the new building, and it was a testament to the retail dominance of the Eaton's department store chain. On October the 30th, 1930, Flora Eaton and her son, John David Eaton, arrived in a chauffeur-driven limousine to open Eaton's new College Street store. They were dressed in all their finery and seemed to be trying to make a statement that Eaton's would go on, undaunted by the economic downturn that had gripped the world. The new College Street store was originally built as a replacement for the Eaton store near Yonge and Queen Streets. Initial plans called for the older Queen Street store to be demolished and either sold or demolished, but it was left open. Eaton's ran a shuttle bus service between the two stores for over 20 years until the Yonge Street subway opened in 1954. Eaton's College Street store was designed in the Art Deco style. This style abandoned the more intricate details of the preceding decades in favor of sweeping lines, cubism, fine craftsmanship, and rich materials. During its heyday, Art Deco represented luxury, glamour, exuberance, and faith in social and technological progress. Lady Eaton hired French architect Jacques Carlu to design the 7th floor of Eaton's College Street. This included the 1,300-seat Eaton Auditorium, which played host to many major performers of the era, including Bill Holiday, Duke Ellington, and Frank Sinatra. In later years, Glenn Gould would become so fond of the acoustics in the Eaton Auditorium that he used it for several of his recordings. The 7th floor also included the elegant Round Room restaurant, which, as its name suggests, is a circular room with a dome ceiling and recessed alcoves along the walls. At the center of the room is the signature fountain, designed by artist René Lalique. Jacques Carlu was responsible for every aspect of the Round Room's design, including the lighting fixtures, the china, the stemware, and the uniforms worn by the waitresses. For several years, the Round Room was considered one of the most elegant places to dine in Toronto, and it helped to put the 7th floor of Eaton's College Street store at the heart of Toronto's cultural life. When Flora Eaton and John David Eaton opened the College Street store in October of 1930, they embodied a level of wealth and elegance that was out of reach for most of the people living in Toronto or the rest of Canada. The Great Depression had only just started, and for several years, people would struggle with hard times, unemployment, and even homelessness. Eaton's had to streamline their business to reduce costs, but despite layoffs and wage cutbacks, there was one aspect of Eaton's operations that remained untouched during the lean years of the 1930s. This was, of course, the Eaton'S Santa Claus Parade. Let's take a look at how the parade looked through the 1920s and 1930s. I'll start off with a couple of more newsreels, one from 1928 and one from 1929. They're both pretty short, so I put them together. And since they were silent film, I added a little bit of seasonal music. You'll notice a couple of characters that are similar to some of the other material I've already shown, including pipe bands, clowns, and Mother Goose, although there are new elements too. Santa arrives on a different float every year, and at the end, he arrives on another giant fish, although it's different from the one that was used in 1919. Long floats that were made to resemble dragon-like caterpillars were popular in the 1920s and 1930s. This one was from the 1925 parade. The head was made from a papier-mâché type material and was dragged along on wheels. The long body of these floats was carried along by a line of parade marchers under cover of the caterpillar's body. These large dolls marched on a similar concept. A person would march in the bottom of the doll, under the hoop of its dress or its trousers, and try to keep things as steady as possible. Although each one was guided along by a helper, they could often be seen swaying back and forth. Fairy tales and biblical stories were both popular themes in the annual Santa Claus Parade. This float from 1926 tells the story of Noah's Ark, and we can see a variety of animals winding their way through the streets of Toronto. And once again, we see the theme of toy soldiers. Now, I'm sure that they could be found on a much smaller scale in Eaton's Toyland department. Eaton started at a Santa Claus Parade in Montreal in 1909, and from 1925, some of the floats and all of the costumes were shipped from Toronto to Montreal for the parade that was there. The Montreal Parade was canceled in 1969, but revived again in the 1990s. This is a literary-themed float from 1930, with some parade participants sitting on an open children's book. Every year, hundreds of children applied to march in the parade, with some of them waiting up to 3 years for their turn. Those children who were chosen were each outfitted in a marvelous made-to-measure costume and were paid a small fee. They were also given hot chocolate and cookies along the parade route. Unlike some of the other big Santa Claus parades that came later in other cities across North America, Eaton's made its own costumes every year. The store's merchandise display department worked year-round to prepare all of the incredible costumes and mechanized floats. The Eaton's Santa Claus Parade continued every year through the Great Depression, and then during the Second World War from 1939 until 1945, there were cutbacks and material shortages, which meant that staff had to get creative when putting the parade together. And yet, the parade lifted the spirits of thousands of children and families during the hard times of the 1930s and 1940s. There certainly was a commercial aspect to the parade, but every year when Santa arrived at Eaton's department store, he offered a glimmer of hope that there might be something under the tree on Christmas morning. In 1947, Eaton's introduced a brand new helper for Santa Claus. This was Pumpkinhead, a teddy bear with a thick, woolly tuft of hair on his head. Pumpkinhead became the main character in a series of children's books that Eaton's published. The store also created a song about Pumpkinhead and sold recordings of it. Pumpkinhead first joined the Santa Claus Parade in 1947, the year that he was invented. He became a fixture of Eaton's Christmas time advertising and appeared in many of the store's toys, clothing, and other accessories. These included everything from kitchenware items like bowls and mugs to furniture like chairs and rocking horses and clothing. The Pumpkinhead-themed toque and mitten set was selling for $1.39 back in 1959, and the children's Pumpkinhead watch sold for a whopping $5.95 that same year. Pretty soon, Eaton's cute little bear was everywhere, and the store had created a successful new merchandising icon. When television started beaming into people's homes in the early 1950s, Eaton's was quick to take advantage of this new advertising platform. Now, I have a recording of an Eaton's Christmas commercial from 1955 featuring Santa, Pumpkinhead, and another toy mascot called Hokey. The ad calls for shoppers to head straight down to Toyland. Just a technical note as I play these commercials, some of them are louder than others, so you may want to have your hand on the volume control so that you can adjust the volume as necessary.
Oh my, what fun we're having here at Eaton's.
All aboard, everybody. Get your tickets ready. Santa Claus, have you ever seen so many trains? Why, they're puffing and tooting all over the place.
Oh, Pumpkinhead, you're so right. Every train from the Toyland workshop must be right here. From the smallest ones right up to the great big ones.
With little whistles and big whistles. Oh, boy, Santa, are we ever having fun?
Yes, Okie, we certainly are.
And Santa, may I have a train for Christmas and a cowboy gun and a bicycle and a baseball glove and a hockey outfit?
Okie, hold on. You are excited. Santa will look at your list just like all the others. But remember, you must be good. And don't forget, boys and girls, to come and visit Santa at Eaton'S.
All the while, as the parade made its way through Toronto every year, and Santa Claus arrived at Eaton's department store on Queen Street, and then climbed up the ladder to the second-story balcony outside the toy department, children were encouraged to come visit Santa in person, or at least to drop him a letter. Another television ad from 1955 encouraged kids to make the trip down to Eaton's to see Santa in person.
Hi, boys and girls. I'm Speedy, one of Santa's elves, and it's my job to sort out all the thousands of letters that are sent to Santa from boys and girls all over the world. And boy, oh boy, am I ever glad to be here with Santa Claus and all his North Pole helpers, meeting all his wonderful friends who come to visit him at Eaton's and join in all the fun and excitement. Santa is busy all day long saying hello to everyone, but he's so glad to be here meeting everyone that he never seems to get the least bit tired.
That's right, Mr. Elf. And we could hardly wait for all our friends to visit us at Eaton's and join in the Christmas fun. So don't forget, boys and girls, to come downtown and say hello to your old friend Santa Claus and all his Toyland helpers. We'll be watching for you.
Children could hand their letters for Santa to the elves that lined the parade route, or they could drop off their letters in Santa's mailbox in Eaton's Toyland, or they could write in from all over Canada. But what happened to the thousands upon thousands of letters that Santa got by way of Eaton's brilliant Christmas time marketing strategy? Well, some of them were saved and are now stored in a special file with the Archives of Ontario. Let's have a look at a few of them. A young 9-year-old girl named Mary wrote this letter at some point in the 1950s. She's included her own drawing of Santa, and she tells him that she really liked his parade. She asks him for a new dollhouse and some furniture to go with it, and lets him know that she'll be leaving out some Coke and food for his reindeer on Christmas Eve. Another 9-year-old named Janet wrote this letter in 1957. She tells Santa how she just loved the parade and how she had a very good seat in the city hall. So I got a very good view of yourself and your reindeer. She said the rest of the parade was super, and super is even underlined. Janet asks for a cage for her budgie, as well as for a stuffed lassie puppy. She points out that she already knows that this costs $8.98. So it's even okay if Santa leaves the price tag on. She ends with best wishes for Mrs. Claus, all the little Clauses, the elves, and even Pumpkinhead. One last note lets Santa know that her daddy is asking for a new Cadillac car. One more letter that I'll share comes from David, who wrote to Santa in the 1960s to say that he stayed home to watch the parade on television, but that he would be coming down to Eaton's to see Santa in person. He also tells Santa that he has a younger brother who is 5 years old, who will presumably be joining David on the Christmas pilgrimage down to Eaton's store. And Santa wrote back too, albeit through a form letter on official Eaton's of Canada stationery. Santa wrote of how happy and excited he was and how happy Pumpkinhead was too. He assured all the children who wrote in that he had read their letters very carefully and that Pumpkinhead helped him to make sure their names were all written in Santa's big book of good boys and good girls. Toronto started to change after the post-war boom of the 1950s. The hippies descended on the coffee houses of Yorkville in the 1960s, and new bars and nightclubs opened up and down Yonge Street. Some of them were right across the street from Eaton's. The streets of Toronto seemed maybe a little less family-friendly than it had been. But in the midst of all the cultural revolution of the 1960s, Eaton's Santa Claus Parade seemed like an anchor of traditionalism. The parade had been an institution for Toronto's families for years, and it was becoming like a nostalgic trip back in time. No matter how the rest of the world changed, Santa would always arrive in Toronto in time for Christmas, thanks to Eaton's department stores. In 1969, which was about the same time that these next few parade photographs were taken, an author named William Stevenson published a history of Eaton's department store called The Store That Timothy Built. The book was published for the 100th anniversary of the opening of Timothy Eaton's first department store back in 1869. The book had a chapter called The Happiest Day of the Year, and this chapter was dedicated to the Santa Claus Parade. Stevenson wrote, "Easily the happiest and most popular way Eaton's has devised to meet its customers is the Santa Claus Parade, held on a Saturday morning in November. Costing close to $100,000 to mount, stretching for at least a mile and a half, entailing the talents of 500 musicians, 1,100 schoolchildren, and 2 Santas, a visible one and a spare, Eaton's Santa Claus Parade, in the flesh and on nationwide color television, officially inaugurates the hectic, joyous melee known as Christmas shopping. Crowds of 600,000 line the streets to cheer the colorful, noisy procession." What makes the Eaton Parade so unique is that alone of other major parades, it features mainly fairy tale and make-believe characters, not current stars of movies and television. Eaton's is the only parade that makes and owns its own costumes, more than 1,000 of them. Big stores like Macy's in New York, Hudson's in Detroit, Gimbel Brothers in Philadelphia also stick to their own personnel for marchers and riders. But Eaton's get thousands of applications every year from children wanting to ride in the parade. These quotes from William Stevenson's book, published in 1969, show us how well regarded Eaton's Toronto Santa Claus Parade was for being a unique, distinctive institution. Other department stores in other cities all across North America had tried to copy Eaton's Santa Claus Parade, but the one that Eaton started here in Toronto was the first, the original, and although it was copied, it could never be duplicated. In 1964, Eaton celebrated its 60th parade. One of the highlights of that year's parade was a special float with an artificial multi-tiered cake that was adorned with pink and white garlands and flowers. There were 2 large diamonds, one at either end of the float, that marked 1964 as the year of Eaton's Diamond Jubilee Parade. The message was clear: come what may, Eaton's was here to stay, and so was its parade. Times might change, but both Eaton's department stores and the parade that it threw every year would last forever. Well, I'm sure that many people might know what happened over the next few years. Earlier in my presentation, I talked about John David Eaton and how his mother, Flora, had groomed him to become the president of Eaton's. He ran the family firm all the way up until his retirement in 1969, and then died just 4 years later in 1973. The company's leadership then passed to his 3 sons, John Craig Eaton, Frederick Stephen Eaton, and George Ross Eaton. These 3 brothers were the great-grandsons of Timothy Eaton, the store's original founder, and it fell to them to keep up the family name. But they all had other interests. George Ross Eaton had always been more interested in fast cars than in corporate leadership. He developed a reputation as the family rebel, who preferred driving race cars to taking care of the family business. When his brother Frederick Stephen Eaton took over as president of Eaton's in 1977, most people still had faith in the department store chain. Although the store had suffered some losses in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, well, this was Eaton's after all. It was such a well-established institution that everyone assumed that it would just keep going on forever. This is Frederick Stephen Eaton at the opening of the second phase of the Eaton Center in 1979. The man on the left is Richard Thompson, the chairman of the Toronto Dominion Bank. The enormous mall that Eaton's built in downtown Toronto seemed to affirm how Eaton's was here to stay. But then, just a few years later, the unthinkable happened. Eaton's department store announced that it could no longer afford to sponsor the Santa Claus Parade. The 1982 parade would be their last. The annual march nearly ground to a halt, but it was rescued by a special Save Our Santa campaign. I don't know if you can make out the button that Santa is holding up in this picture, but it reads Toronto Santa Parade, I Love Santa, and Save Our Santa. When Eaton's announced its decision to stop the parade, several sponsors stepped in and the parade was able to continue. These days, Toronto Santa Claus Parade is sponsored by a variety of companies, including McDonald's, Toys R Us, Canadian Tire, and Tim Hortons. But when Eaton's dropped its involvement back in 1982, it was another death knell for the great Canadian retailer. This is George Ross Eaton announcing Eaton's insolvency at a news conference on February the 27th, 1997. He would be the last family member to be involved in the company's management, and he stepped down as chief executive officer after making the announcement. At the same time, Eaton's had a total of more than 90 retail stores and about 24,500 employees. There were plans to close some of the underperforming stores or to lay off staff, but all of this was too little, too late. Eaton's officially went bankrupt in August of 1999, almost exactly 130 years to the day after Timothy Eaton opened his first store near the end of 1869. The Eaton family had been like Canadian retail royalty for 4 generations, but now their reign was over. But at least Toronto's annual Santa Claus Parade is still going on, although Eaton's shuttered the doors of its last stores over 20 years ago now. Not even COVID-19 could really stop the parade that Timothy Eaton started all the way back in 1905. In 2020, the first year of the pandemic, the public elements of the parade were canceled because of COVID, but the parade was staged at Canada's Wonderland, where it was filmed and then broadcast over television sets on December the 5th, 2020. The same format was used the next year, and the parade was broadcast on Saturday, December the 4th, 2021 at 7:00 p.m. This year in 2022, the Santa Claus Parade finally returned live in person to the streets of Toronto. The parade took place on Sunday, November the 20th, and is scheduled for broadcast on CTV on Saturday, December the 3rd, 2022. Toronto's annual Santa Claus Parade has brought a lot of people, a lot of fun memories and sentimental nostalgia for 117 years now, ever since the first Santa stepped off a train at Union Station and walked to the Eaton store on Queen Street. As I conclude, I'd like to show you one last clip from one of these Santa Claus parades from years gone by. The narrator does an excellent job of summing up the memories that many of us may have of watching the parade and waiting for Santa's arrival.
And there he was at last, Santa Claus, in a most magnificent cloak, all green and white, with great banks of snow, Christmas trees, and 2 little houses. There was Santa himself, sitting in the midst of it all. Remember the crowds that watched as Santa arrived at Eaton's? Just think of all the thousands of children who visited Santa in Toyland. They won't forget that day for a long, long time.
This concludes my presentation on the Eaton family, their department store, and the Toronto Santa Claus Parade. Don't forget to leave any questions or feedback or memories in the video comments. And if you enjoyed it, please feel free to share with your friends. Also, just one last reminder that donations are welcome, but not necessary. If you'd like to make a donation, you can email me at richard@muddyyorktours.com to make donations online. There are also links in the video description below that will take you to my website, my Facebook group, and my Instagram account, which has hundreds of photographs of Toronto history. Thanks again for watching.